Well, hi there, and welcome back to Her Shrink Ray Eye. I'm Joan Biediger, and today I want to talk about a way of creating that most of us recognize immediately, but don't always know how to describe or define. It's that stretch of time when you're building something, but you don't yet have a clear picture of where it's going. You're not stuck, you're not having a creative block. The project is just unfinished in your own mind. You've got parts on the bench, you've got tools out, maybe you even have a loose direction. But if someone asked you to explain exactly what this build is going to become, you'd hesitate. You might give a vague answer, or you might say, honestly, I'm not sure yet. And that uncertainty can feel uncomfortable in a hobby that often celebrates finished work and clear concepts and strong visual statements. I've talked before about how ideas can begin to form through small physical actions at the bench, sometimes before we're even fully aware of it. Today, I want to stay with what happens before and after that moment, because a lot of miniature work doesn't begin with a fully formed vision, and it doesn't move in a straight line once an idea appears. There's usually a long middle stretch where you're still figuring out what the work is asking for, even if you're already committed to making it. This is the difference between a blueprint and wayfinding. A blueprint assumes you already know the destination and you're just executing steps. Wayfinding is what you do when you're moving through something and learning it at the same time. You take a few steps, you check what you can see now, and you correct course. A lot of miniature work, especially anything narrative or atmospheric, behaves more like the iterative stages of the creative process than a linear design path. You're not failing to plan. You're working in a situation where the plan is incomplete until the work exists. It doesn't sound decisive, and it doesn't fit neatly into advice that says you should know your concept before you begin. And to be fair, sometimes that advice is exactly right, especially if you're on a deadline or building something you've built before. In fact, sometimes the problem isn't a lack of clarity, it's the wrong kind of clarity showing up too early. You can lock onto an idea that's neat in your head but dead on the bench. You start making decisions to protect the concept instead of serving the piece. I don't know how many times where I have started a project and I know as I'm going along, I'm not doing the right thing, but I keep on going, and that's when a build starts to feel forced. You're defending an early story instead of responding to what the work is actually doing. At miniature scale, this uncertainty can feel risky. Glue sets things in place. Paint commits color schemes. Shaping plastic and putty can start to shape the vision itself. So not knowing where you're headed can trigger some anxiety that you're about to ruin something. Sometimes you think if you just waited until the vision was clearer, everything would go more smoothly. But what I want to suggest is that building without a finished vision isn't a mistake or a weakness in your process. It's a legitimate mode of making. In miniature work, we often begin with something much smaller than a full vision. A mood, a material, maybe it's a constraint or a question. Sometimes it's as simple as wanting to explore a certain kind of light or the feeling of a figure standing still in space. You don't yet know what the final scene will be. You don't know the story. You might not even know what matters most yet, but your hands start anyway. You clean a part, you prime a surface just to see how it changes the material. Those actions aren't placeholders until the real idea shows up. They are the thinking. And that's the shift I want to explore. The idea that not all creative work starts with clarity, and not all clarity comes before commitment. Sometimes the work itself is how the vision forms. What's interesting is that this way of working isn't just common, it's also well documented in design research, especially in how people solve creative problems when the goal itself is still taking shape. When the goal isn't fully defined yet, you don't get clarity first and action second. You get small moves, feedback, adjustment, and I want to stay close to what that looks like at the bench and why it works. Not to rush the uncertainty away, but to work inside it without panic and without giving up too soon. One of the reasons this kind of building feels so unsettling is that we tend to assume creative work should behave like a well-defined problem. A well-defined problem is the kind where you know what success looks like before you start. The goal is clear. The steps might be challenging, but they're oriented toward a known endpoint. You can usually tell whether you're getting closer or farther away. A lot of instructional thinking about creativity tends to assume this structure. Decide what you want to make, plan your steps, execute the plan. But many creative tasks and projects aren't clear and don't work that way at all. When people actually study how creative work unfolds, this isn't treated as a flaw, it's treated as normal. Part of why this stage feels so uncomfortable is that we tend to expect creative work to behave like a problem with a clear shape from the start. Researchers often describe them as ill-defined problems. And that phrase sounds academic, but it describes something very familiar at the bench. An ill-defined problem is one where the goal itself is incomplete. It's shifting or not yet fully understood. You don't start with a clear picture of the solution. In fact, you often don't even fully understand what the problem is until you've been working on it for a while. Dioramas, vignettes, kit bashes, weathering heavy builds, narrative scenes, these almost always begin as ill-defined problems. You might know the subject or the scale or the general mood you're after, but the actual meaning of the piece, the balance of elements, the emotional center, sometimes those things often emerge through the work, not before it. And this is where miniature practice becomes really interesting. At the bench, you're constantly getting feedback from the materials themselves. A texture behaves differently than you expected. Maybe a color shifts under a different light. A figure's pose reads one way in isolation and another once it's placed in context. Each of these small encounters changes your understanding of what the piece could or should be. Design researchers describe this as a kind of back and forth with materials, where form isn't imposed in advance, but grows through continuous engagement. So the problem you thought you were solving at the start evolves slowly. You might begin thinking you're building a setting, then you realize you're actually building a moment. You might start with a figure and end up organizing everything around where the viewer's eye pauses first. What's happening here is something designers and researchers have described for decades. The problem and the solution develop together. Donald Schoen wrote about this kind of back and forth as part of reflective practice. As you make, you learn what the work needs, and as you learn, the work changes. This is why waiting for a finished vision before starting can sometimes be counterproductive. Some of the clarity you're waiting for can only appear once your hands are involved. This doesn't mean you're wandering aimlessly. It means you're operating in a mode where discovery is part of the process, not a detour from it. There's a relational idea I find particularly helpful here, sometimes described as thinking in action. Instead of separating thinking and making into two neat phases, the thinking happens while you're doing. You make a move, you observe the result, and that observation changes what you do next. At miniature scale, this happens constantly, and sometimes we aren't even aware that it is happening. When you temporarily place a figure and step back, you're evaluating how the space behaves with a human presence in it. None of those actions require a finished vision. They require attention. It's attention that allows you to notice when a build is pulling you in a different direction than you expected. It's attention that lets you stay engaged without forcing premature decisions just to relieve discomfort. This is also where many people start to feel uneasy, especially if they're used to clear plans. Because working this way asks you to tolerate a certain amount of ambiguity for longer than feels comfortable. You're moving forward without guarantees, but that discomfort doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. In fact, studies of creative practitioners across many fields suggests that the ability to stay with uncertainty, to continue working while things are still unresolved, is a key part of complex creative practice. Not endless uncertainty, not chaos, but a willingness to let understanding happen gradually. At the bench, this often looks very ordinary. It looks like leaving something unglued a little longer than usual. And it looks like testing 3 variations instead of choosing the first acceptable one. And this is an important distinction. You're not waiting passively for inspiration to strike. You're actively engaged in a conversation with the work. And once you see that, a question naturally follows. What do people actually do when the ending isn't clear? Not as productivity strategies and not as optimization schemes, but as patterns of making that translate beautifully to miniature work. Because once you understand how people build when they don't know the ending, it becomes much easier to trust yourself in that long middle stretch without rushing toward false clarity or abandoning a build that hasn't finished speaking yet. When the outcome isn't clear, people tend to fall back on a couple of old, very human patterns of making. These aren't tricks, they're not shortcuts, they're ways of staying in motion when prediction isn't possible. You already used them at the bench. The first is building from what you already have. This is the mode where you stop asking, what do I need in order to make this work? And start asking, what can I do with what's in front of me right now? In miniature work, this shows up everywhere. In the spares box, the leftover decals, the strip of textured plastic you didn't throw away. Maybe it's the base that was meant for something else, but happens to fit your current scene surprisingly well. Instead of treating those materials as compromises, you treat them as collaborators. You let them suggest directions you didn't plan. This kind of building doesn't require a finished vision. It requires curiosity and responsiveness. You're not forcing the materials to serve an idea that hasn't fully formed yet. You're allowing the materials to participate in shaping the idea. And this is important because it means the work doesn't stall just because your mental picture is incomplete. You can still move forward, you can still test, you can still discover. The second pattern shows up in how experienced makers make decisions when they can't predict the outcome. Instead of starting with a fixed goal and working backward, sometimes they start with their means, their skills, their habits, their preferences, and their constraints. At the bench, this often sounds like, I know how to do this kind of weathering. I only have a few evenings to work on this. I'm better with figures than vehicles. These aren't limitations, they're starting points. When you build this way, you don't demand that the final piece be fully defined before you begin. You let the goal sharpen as you go, shaped by what you can realistically do, revise, and sustain. This is why some builds feel surprisingly calm even when the outcome is unclear. You're not trying to control everything in advance. You're working within what you know you can handle, and that matters, especially at miniature scale, where overcommitting too early can lead to frustration. What both of these approaches share is a shift in where confidence comes from. The confidence doesn't come from knowing exactly what the finished piece will be. It comes from trusting your ability to respond. People sometimes describe this as a kind of improvisation, not chaos, but learning by doing, where you don't fully know the outcome until it's already taking shape. To notice when something works, to adjust when it doesn't. To recognize when a small decision opens up new possibilities instead of closing them down. This is also why so many experienced modelers look deceptively relaxed while working on complex builds. It's not because they're more inspired, it's because they're comfortable letting the work reveal itself in stages. They know that clarity doesn't always happen all at once. It often occurs incrementally, through placement, through testing, through stepping back and really looking. This doesn't mean there's no direction. It means the direction is provisional. It's flexible, allowed to evolve. And that flexibility is what keeps the build going. In miniature work, it's often the moment you insist on locking everything down too early that things start to feel rigid or forced. The scene stops breathing. The decisions stop talking to each other. Because ambiguity doesn't just sit there neutrally at the bench. It changes how you feel about your decisions. It can make you want to rush, restart, or abandon a build. Not because you're careless, but because uncertainty creates pressure. There's a reason this way of working can feel harder than it sounds. It's not just that the outcome is unclear, it's that uncertainty asks something emotional of you, not just something technical. When you're building without a finished vision, your brain doesn't get the reassurance it usually wants. There's no clear marker that says, yes, you're doing this correctly, or you're definitely on the right path. And without that reassurance, it's easy for doubt to creep in. Am I wasting time? Should I stop and rethink this? Would it be smarter to start over once I know more? Those questions don't come from lack of discipline. They come from a very normal human preference for closure. Our minds like problems that resolve cleanly. They like knowing when effort is paying off. Miniature work doesn't always offer that kind of feedback. Sometimes it does. Some builds are clear from beginning to end. But for some people, that isn't how creativity unfolds. In this case, miniature work can be especially difficult when it's in the middle. This is the stage where nothing looks finished yet, but a lot of decisions have already been made. You've invested time, you've committed materials, and you're still not entirely sure what you're building toward. That's a vulnerable place to be. Psychologists sometimes talk about this in terms of tolerance for ambiguity. That phrase can sound abstract, but at the bench it's very concrete. It's the ability to stay present when the answer isn't obvious yet, to keep working even when you can't fully explain what the work is becoming. And that tolerance isn't a fixed personality trait. It's something that shifts depending on context, energy, and experience. Some days ambiguity feels manageable. Other days it feels like friction in your chest. When the uncertainty starts to feel uncomfortable, there's often an urge to resolve it quickly, to force a decision, to lock something down just so the uncertainty stops. You glue the part even though you're not convinced. Maybe you choose the first acceptable color instead of testing another one. You declare the build good enough or not working before it's had a chance to clarify. None of that makes you careless. It just means you're responding to the stress of not knowing. But here's what often gets missed. Uncertainty is often a signal that the build is still thinking. When you're working on something that's genuinely exploratory, the lack of clarity usually peaks right before something starts to come together. That's not a guarantee, of course, but it's a common pattern. The danger is mistaking that peak discomfort for a verdict. This is where experienced makers tend to do something different. They don't rush to eliminate ambiguity, they narrow it. Instead of asking, what is this whole piece supposed to be, they might ask, what's the next small thing I can learn? They shift the scale of the question. What happens if I change the light direction? What if the base texture is rougher here and smoother there? What if I move this figure 2 millimeters to the left? Those questions are answerable, and each answer reduces uncertainty just enough to keep the work moving. This is also how miniature work builds creative resilience over time. You're constantly practicing how to stay engaged without needing full certainty. You're learning how to tolerate the feeling of not yet without turning it into panic or self-criticism. That doesn't mean forcing yourself to push through at all costs. Sometimes the most responsible thing you can do is pause. Step back, let the piece rest. But that's different from abandoning it out of discomfort. There's a difference between listening to the work and fleeing the uncertainty. One of the skills that develops over time is learning to tell those two apart. You start to recognize when a build is asking for patience rather than answers, when the unease you feel isn't a warning sign but a transition point. And once you recognize that, the middle becomes less daunting. Still challenging, still demanding, but no longer a personal failure. What helps here is having some structure inside the uncertainty. Not rigid plans, just small forms of clarity that make it easier to keep going without forcing the ending too soon. Because building without a finished vision doesn't mean building without intention. It just means letting intention operate at the right scale. One of the misunderstandings about working without a finished vision is that it means working without structure. It doesn't. It just means the structure is local instead of global. Instead of asking the work to tell you everything, it will become you ask it smaller, more immediate questions. You create just enough clarity to keep moving without pretending you know the ending. At the bench, this often starts with what I think of as a very small brief, not a concept statement, not a story, just one clear intention for the session. It might be something like, today I'm only figuring out the light direction, or today I want to see how a figure changes a space. That's it. You're not deciding the whole build. You're deciding what kind of attention is needed today. This does a couple of important things. It gives your brain something definite to focus on, and it gives you permission to stop once that small question has been answered, instead of spiraling into bigger decisions before you're ready. Another stabilizing move is separating decisions by how reversible they are. In decision-making processes, some choices are information gathering, some set direction, and some lock things in. When everything feels uncertain, it helps to know which category you're in. Testing a color on scrap plastic? Low risk, pure information. Temporarily placing a figure with poster putty? Direction setting, but still flexible. Gluing something permanently or committing to a final paint pass? That's a lock-in decision. When you're building without a finished vision, most of your early moves should live in the first two categories. You're not avoiding commitment forever, you're sequencing it. This alone can reduce a lot of anxiety at the bench because it reminds you that not every action carries the same weight. You're allowed to explore before you decide. There's also a real skill in recognizing when a decision has earned the right to be permanent. That moment usually doesn't happen because you suddenly feel certain. It happens because you've seen enough evidence. You've tested variations. You've compared outcomes. You've worked with the piece long enough that one direction consistently feels stronger than the others. That's when committing feels like following the work, not forcing it. Another way to stay grounded in this middle stage is to work with what I think of as local goals rather than final ones. A local goal is something like, make this area easier to read when I step back. Make these two materials look like they belong together. These are goals you can meet without knowing the whole story yet, and meeting them builds momentum, not just progress. This is where a lot of people are surprised to discover that they can enter a focused, absorbed state without having a finished vision. You're working at the right scale. There's one more practical piece that helps here, and it's deceptively simple. Externalizing what you're noticing. Take a quick photo, jot down a sentence, say out loud, "This is becoming about light," or "This feels more static than I expected." Those small acts of naming do something important. They capture emerging clarity before it disappears. They give you something to return to when doubt creeps back in later. And they help you see that a vision is forming, even if it's still incomplete. Working this way doesn't make the process faster, it makes it steadier. You're no longer demanding that the work reveal everything up front. You're allowing it to speak in stages, and you're giving yourself the tools to listen without losing confidence. And when you put all of this together, it changes what it even means to know what you're making. Not as a method to follow, but as a way of working that makes room for the middle, especially when there's pressure to present finished, resolved work. It can sometimes drown out the less visible parts of the process, because building without a finished vision isn't something to grow out of. For many of us, it's something we grow into, or simply a place we find ourselves in from time to time. I want to end by reframing something that comes up often in this hobby. The idea that you should know what you're making before you begin. That expectation can feel reasonable, even responsible. After all, miniature work takes time, it takes care, it asks for commitment, and it's natural to want to feel confident that you're investing those things wisely. But confidence doesn't always come from clarity at the beginning every time. Sometimes it comes from experience with the middle of a project, from knowing that you've been here before, that you've worked through builds that didn't announce themselves clearly at first, that you've learned how to listen, adjust, and stay present long enough for something real to take shape. Building without that finished vision isn't about being vague or unfocused. It's about allowing the work to teach you what it needs rather than insisting that you already know everything from the beginning. At miniature scale, this is especially powerful because small changes matter. Tiny shifts in placement, color, texture, or light can completely alter how a piece reads. And those shifts are often invisible until the work exists in front of you. You can't always fully imagine them in advance. You have to make them. So if you find yourself at the bench working steadily but unable to explain where the build is going just yet, that doesn't mean you're behind. It doesn't mean you've missed something. It means you're inside the part of the process that rarely gets named but does a lot of the real work. Where the vision isn't absent, it's forming. Over time, many experienced makers stop chasing certainty at the start, not because they don't care about outcomes, but because they trust their ability to respond. They trust that clarity will arrive through engagement, not before it. That trust doesn't make every build easier, but it does make the uncertainty less frightening. It turns the long middle from something to escape into something you can inhabit. So the next time a build feels unfinished in your mind, try not to treat that as a problem to solve immediately. Treat it as a signal that you're still in conversation with the work. Ask a smaller question. Make a reversible move. Pay attention to what changes. The vision doesn't need to be complete in order to be real. Sometimes it just needs room. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a fellow hobbyist, subscribe, follow, or simply take a little time to listen when you can. I appreciate every person who joins me here. I'll be right here with my lamp on, brush in hand, story waiting. Before I sign off today, I want to thank the Shepherd Payne Education Fund for their support of this podcast and their commitment to education in the miniature arts. Until next time, keep your hands steady, see clearly, nod obediently, and keep your story your own. Thanks for listening.